welcome back to MNVA Geography, where we are currently continuing our discussion on governments. We're going to start here today at the 3.2 Study 2, Section 3, Authoritarianism. Have you ever read George Orwell's book 1984? The book describes life under a repressive government that controls the actions, minds, and emotions of the people. The hero rebels against the government by falling in love with a woman. He is captured and tortured as punishment. At the end, he decides that he does love the government leader, Big Brother. It is depressing, but a fascinating read. 1984 is fiction. No real government has been able to control the lives and minds of the people, but it is not for lack of trying. Governments can be classified by how much power they have over people's daily lives. In a totalitarian government, the government has total control over actions and beliefs. This form of government is rare. It is hard to maintain that much control. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were both totalitarian governments, as is the government of North Korea today. An authoritarian government has a lot of power over people's actions, but it does not try to have total control over their lives. This has been the most common form of government in human history. There are also forms of limited government that have specific limits on the power of government. The United States is a limited government, as are most governments in Europe. Finally, anarchy is the absence of government. Anarchy is most often found in failed states. You may have noticed a pattern here. Most governments with a lot of power are also governments that are dominated by a single person or a small group. Most democracies limit the power of the government. A few people with a lot of power. For most of human history, most governments have been authoritarian, and most governments have been autocracies or oligarchies. Over the last few decades, that balance has changed, with more nations shifting to democratic governments with limits on their power. Most ancient civilizations were governed by authoritarian powers, although there were some early experiments with democracies, such as the Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic. These were the rare exception. More common were the dictatorships like the one in Sparta or the Roman Empire that replaced the Roman Republic. Slavery and involuntary military service were common features in these early authoritarian governments. Authoritarian empires spanned nearly the entire globe during much of the Middle Ages. Tsars, emperors, sultans, and ruled authoritarian empires in Russia, China, Japan, and the Middle East, and in Northern Africa. The actual powers of these large, far-reaching empires varied from ruler to ruler, as did the viciousness, violence, and oppression. European rulers established autocratic, absolute monarchies throughout the Middle Ages and ruled virtually unchecked for centuries before any form of popular control was exerted. The Magna Carta began the process of limiting these monarchs, but it was many centuries before popular sovereignty brought an end to authoritarian rule in Europe. Monarchs continued to rule in Europe and elsewhere throughout the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, even as the idea of popular sovereignty began to take hold. Democratic revolutions, such as those in the United States and France, took a long time to occur. Even afterwards, democratic revolutions were very far and few between in the 20th century. The French Revolution promised democracy to a nation ruled by an absolute monarch. Instead, it resulted in authoritarian backlash. The turmoil of the revolution brought Napoleon Bonaparte to power. France had a series of autocratic rulers for nearly a century afterwards, and other European monarchs carefully guarded against the success of democratic movements for fear of repeating the French Revolution. Decolonization sometimes resulted in democratic governments, but more often than not, the new government in the former colony was seized by a dictator. In many cases, civil wars and coups followed, leading to a series of authoritarian states. Today, those former colonies in Africa are home to some of the world's most repressive and violent authoritarian regimes. Communist ideology was built around the idea that if people controlled all the economic resources, then they could make a paradise. In reality, though, communist nations have been less about paradise and more about power. The Soviet Union became one of the models that the political scientists use when they developed the definition of totalitarian governments. Justifying authoritarianism. Not all authoritarian governments are the same. Authoritarian governments force their ideas onto their citizens, but the justification for this varies from state to state. Sometimes they use fear. Some authoritarian governments rule by force alone. They keep their citizens in line through fear and violence. Divine right. Others claim to have divine right to rule. The doctrine of divine rights of kings asserted that the king's power came directly from God. Ideology. Often authoritarian governments maintain that they rule because they are the only political group capable of bringing about justice on the earth. This is a form of ideological dictatorship. Totalitarianism. Finally, some authoritarian governments maintain absolute control over their people. This extreme form of authoritarianism is known as totalitarianism. You can remember the difference because it's total control, totalitarianism. Page 4. Justifying authoritarian rule. It's easy to understand how democratic or even communist governments justify power. Appealing to the will or good of the people is a straightforward way of legitimizing the state's authority. Authoritarian governments have more difficult time justifying their power, but they do it nonetheless. Take a moment here to log on to page 4 to complete this self-check. Page 5. Evaluating authoritarianism. Living in an authoritarian state doesn't sound like fun, does it? But there are definite downsides to this type of government, yet there are also people who favor their authoritarian state. So log on to page 5 to complete that self-check. Autocracy today. Authoritarianism has a long history, and while it's been slowly declining, it hasn't been erased from the earth. Even in places where governments have been converted to democracy, authoritarian elements still exist. England used to be an absolute monarchy, but it gave birth to some of the most important democratic ideas. England underwent a slow process of democratization, sometimes leading the way in democratic innovation. Yet, England still has a monarchy even today. The head of the state is the Queen of England, and the British taxpayers support the monarchy with their hard-earned pounds. That's British money, not their weight. However, the Queen's role is largely symbolic. She has little real power. The same is true of the remaining monarchies of the world today. Saudi Arabia. There are few real monarchies left in the world. Saudi Arabia is one example. This country is ruled by King Abdullah, who must approve the laws passed by the Council of Ministers. But even Saudi Arabia is feeling pressure of democratization. In 2005, the country has held its first elections for local government positions, although women were excluded from running and from voting. However, all law in the country is still subject to approval by the king.